So, welcome to session 2 of Data Center Policy in Practice, Bans, Moratoriums, Zoning, How to Stop or Limit Data Center Development. My name is Ali Finn. I'm the Director of Community Partnerships at the AI Now Institute and also part of the Data Center Working Group, and I will be facilitating our conversation today. This is the second session of our Data Center Policy in Practice training series, which is based on our North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit and co-hosted with the Data Center Working Group. If you missed last week, you can watch the recording here. We're dropping it in the chat of the first session, which was a grounding about the AI industry and corporate power and how to take that back. Next slide. Really quickly, who are we? The AI Now Institute is a policy research organization that pushes back against the trajectory of the AI industry away from commercial surveillance, concentration of power, and lack of public accountability. We are a member of the Data Center Working Group, which is a multi-state, cross-issue network fighting to stop the data center build-out and for a different future where tech and energy infrastructure serves the public good. We're made up of community groups and local, state, and national orgs across the country, and we offer support for site fights, a bi-weekly working group for people moving regional and state strategies, and strategizing on federal policy and nationwide advocacy, and we'll share ways to get involved. Next slide. Every session of our 8-part training series is going to dive deep into a specific policy area to identify the strongest possible policy recommendations to stop data centers across all of these different areas, as well as scaffolded steps to get there. We're focusing on policy not because it's a be-all, end-all, but because it can be a critical tool for organizing and building power to change the conditions of the data center build-out. You can sign up for future sessions at the same registration link. Next slide. This session is going to break down the most direct policy interventions we have to stop data center development, which is bans and moratoriums or pauses. And we will also explore a range of zoning interventions that can be used when full bans are not an option. We're going to start with analysis from Jenna Reddick at Free Press about the increasing momentum of local moratoriums, tribal moratoriums, and bans, and the calls for federal and state moratoriums. I'm going to do a how-to in the weeds of these particular policy interventions from the toolkit to make clear that we have many strategies available, from expressly restricting data centers to increasing the power of localities in application and approval processes. And then we will spend most of the session with a stellar organizer and advocate panel featuring Taylor, Frazier, McCollum, Liz Simmy, and Michael Parker to really get into our on-the-ground strategies. Okay, I am going to welcome Jenna to start us off. Please drop any questions you have for Jenna into the Q&A box. Jenna is Advocacy Director at Free Press, where she supports the organization's policy, legal, and communications work across issue areas. She also teaches at the American University Washington College of Law, and she has spent over a decade researching and reporting on community resistance to industrial infrastructure. So Jenna, next slide, please. Kate, can you walk us through this momentum? What's happening? Who's driving this? And what are the opportunities?
Absolutely. Can you hear me? I think yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all talking about data centers in general, but bans and moratoriums in particular. And since I've been tasked with setting the stage, I put together this one slide last night. These are all headlines about data center moratoriums in just the United States from just this past week. Several are from the past 24 hours. Ali will be guiding us through the mechanisms of bans and moratoriums next, so I'll just offer a few framing notes to keep in mind about the current moment we're in before we dive into the policy discussion and then our incredible organizers panel. The first note is about momentum, which in this context has two sides. I couldn't have created this slide even at this time last year. I would have had to include months worth of headlines just to reach a critical mass. Not a single state-level moratorium had been imposed at that time. At least a dozen have been proposed just since the start of this year. Last December 2025, we also saw hundreds of groups across the country come together to call for a national moratorium, along with proposals from Senator Sanders and Representative Ocasio-Cortez at the federal level. The Seminole Nation of Oklahoma passed a moratorium just last month with the support of Honor the Earth and their No Data Centers on Native Land campaign. So there is a lot of positive momentums on the organizing side. And relatedly, individual moratoriums have bought time when time is at a premium. They have slowed the momentum of industry. And as we all know, I suspect there's a reason companies use tools like NDAs to shield project details from the public until the last possible minute. And one of the main reasons is that they're trying to ensure that all of their ducks are in a row before they encounter any public opposition. Moratoriums are a tool to interrupt that. They're one of many ways the communities are saying, not so fast, not until we know what's going on, not until we've had our say, and maybe not at all. So that's item 1 and 1.5, momentum. Item number 2 is pushback. As our panelists will also speak to, passing a moratorium is not an easy lift. As you can see from a few of the headlines, just from this past week, communities have had to win over local officials who have often been talking to and wooed by tech companies and data center developers for months before the public gets to have their say. And also, passing a moratorium is far from the end of the road. Most moratoriums are temporary and passed for a set period of time, although they can be and often are extended, which Taylor can talk about in Prince George's County's case. But then even if a moratorium does get passed, we're already seeing legal challenges, something that's not unique to moratoriums, but is also true for other policy measures that effectively block specific data center projects. And then the third note, and the one I'd like to end on before turning it back to Allie, is a reflection on what moratoriums have already achieved beyond the specifics of any specific local fight. Because as moratoriums have gained momentum, which we've been seeing increasingly in the past 6 to 8 months in particular, so have critiques about their strategic value, about whether or not they're just the ultimate NIMBY or not in my backyard play, etc. But in the face of relentless rhetoric from industry about the inevitability of data center expansion, about the inevitability of AI, about the inevitability of all the associated displacement and extraction and harm, moratoriums are maybe the most proportionate response we're seeing because they aren't just rejections of individual data center projects. They're rejections of a much larger political and economic project underway, which anyone who's organizing on the ground knows, and which I know our panel will illustrate today. And so as a result, we're also seeing communities across the US and outside of the US connect with one another to share lessons learned and to lend support so that the implementation of any one moratorium doesn't just shift the burden to another community. And so that a moratorium win isn't just a local blow to a single data center developer, but that it does contribute to this larger rejection of a sense of inevitability that's being imposed on all of us by a very small group of people who stand to profit very heavily from us believing it. But we're not buying it, which is why we're all here today. And we truly could not have a better group of folks to get into it. So I will stop here so that we can get into it, and I'll kick it back to you, Allie.
Thank you so much, Jenna, for that grounding and for locating us in the very exciting moment that we're in. I'm leaving that with a sense of the power that we have across the country. I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of these policy interventions. Next slide, please. And looking at the results from the poll that we shared, at least half of our virtual room has said that they weren't sure or don't understand how to use these tools and if they apply in their local jurisdiction. And similarly, a majority of people were trying to still figure out what interventions would work. So this is the section we will get into the policy side, and then in our panel, we will talk about how this works in practice. So very briefly, I'm just going to give you all a short overview of our North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit so you can also use it in other policy areas, not just zoning. The North Star Data Center Policy Toolkit is geared towards stopping, slowing, and restricting rampant data center development in the US at the local, state, and federal level. And I'll also highlight that there are tribal interventions as well that we will mention and will be adding. Next slide, please. The guide includes North Star interventions, the strongest possible tools, as well as scaffolded steps to get there for when that is not feasible and when our political conditions are challenging. The policy toolkit came out of a need from organizers and policymakers across the country to take advantage of critical moments of opportunity to identify and call for the strongest possible interventions. And the toolkit, next slide, is really a menu of options that maps all the possible policy tools from bans and zoning, which we'll go over today, to water, air, energy, taxation, transparency, corporate power, and beyond, since not everything will be possible in every jurisdiction. But regardless of what your entry point is, all of these policy recommendations are framed on the belief that we, the public, should decide whether or not a data center works in the interests of our communities. Next slide. And I want to shout out briefly that we developed this toolkit in consultation with 100+ community organizers, state advocates, technical experts, and policymaker networks across the country. Some are named here, and we also include existing policy and organizing resources throughout. Next slide. Bans, moratoriums, and zoning. What are our strongest tools here? Next slide. Remember, there are so many ways to stop a data center. Zoning and land use vary extremely drastically by state and locality. We're going to go through some tips at the end of this presentation about how to know what will work for you. But if you can't explicitly or fully ban a data center, all hope is not lost. There are many other strategies available. Some of those are in policy, and some of them also involve organizing, campaigning, and legal strategies, which we'll talk about in our discussion. Next slide. But let's start with the most direct way to prohibit data centers, explicit bans. Across the country, you can use ordinances or ballot measures to explicitly prohibit construction of new data center facilities and prohibit expansion of existing data centers. This just happened in Monterey Park, the first city in California to fully ban data centers in city limits. Bans, however, can be complete or partial. You can prohibit data centers within certain zoning districts, for example, preventing data centers in residential areas or agricultural areas like Prince William County in Virginia. You can ban facilities over a certain square footage, like Groton, Connecticut, or restrict them by resource use in terms of megawatts used. That's our recommendation. It's important to note that localities might not call this type of intervention a ban based on local politics and preemption concerns, but this can effectively block out hyperscale development, and it is one of our strongest tools. I want to also offer a cautionary note here that we are seeing some localities explore restricting data centers to only industrial zones. This can limit some harms, but does not fully mitigate the harmful impacts overall, particularly because industrial zones are often sited next to Black and brown neighborhoods or other marginalized communities that have already faced decades of environmental racism. So that's a critical consideration that we're seeing play out in the build-out across the country. Another note here and throughout, you may need legal support, especially if your state preempts or prevents your locality from banning certain types of development, including through exclusionary zoning. Next slide, please. Moratoriums. As we heard from Jenna, these are a key tool, and I like to talk about them as a practical, common sense pause on the build out to give a locality or a state time to update or issue regulations. These can turn into a ban, like Groton, Connecticut. Moratoriums are time-bound prohibitions on new data center approvals. They are not permanent, although as we will hear from Taylor, they can in some cases be extended. We recommend that a moratorium lasts for at least 6 months, but note that you will likely need longer, and we're seeing many that are now passed at a year. We are seeing moratoriums passed by local governments, such as Prince George's County and Big Rapids, Michigan, tribal nations, as we discussed in the previous session, and at least 12 states have filed data center moratorium bills. Maine was the first to pass this legislation, although the governor recently vetoed it. And I also want to highlight that utilities themselves can pass moratoriums on data center connections. This is not theoretical. This actually happened with AEP Ohio. Again, moratoriums, common sense pauses, and they need to be followed up with strong protections for them to have a lasting impact. Next slide. So what do you do if you can't explicitly ban a data center, or if you can't pass a moratorium, or maybe if you have a lot of power already and don't want to channel that towards a moratorium, but towards lasting protections? There are a few options here. Localities can build mechanisms into approval and zoning processes to reject data centers that don't meet their local standards or goals. To do this, you first need strong local goals that are set and passed by the local government. These can be around water use, energy, heat, economic development. There's many options here. And you can also use existing standards, such in the case of Phoenix, which has clean air goals that far exceed federal air quality standards. Once you have these goals, you then need to hold developers accountable and make sure that their proposals are responding to these standards and make them put the burden on them to prove how the project fits within these goals. We encourage independent review by experts with decision-making authority, not companies grading their own homework. So localities can require companies, for example, to fund pre-approval studies, but not to conduct them themselves. I want to note that this approach requires real enforcement power, which is something we are seeing lacking across the country. We are seeing in some cases fines of $1,000 a day. That means a lot to me, but not to an extremely wealthy corporation. So with these, with these zoning amendments and with these ordinances, we need real enforcement power that includes meaningful, non-nominal fines and the power to reject applications. So how do we do that? Next slide, please. One way to approach this, although it is not the only way, and it might be called something different in your locality, is conditional use permits. Conditional use permits require developers to apply to the zoning board for permission to use their property in special ways. The approval is conditional. Developers have to meet certain requirements set by the local government in order to receive this approval. To do this, localities can amend zoning code or introduce new ordinances to create a separate conditional use permitting process for data centers. This requires defining data centers, setting a distinct class for data centers so they are not included in existing zoning regulations, not included in by right zoning, which often gives data centers automatic or easier approval. We encourage you, if this is your approach, to define data centers expansively. For example, not limiting them to AI use, since many data centers, the reported use is, for example, cloud computing, which is closely linked to AI. And we're dropping in one possible definition in the chat from our toolkit. I also want to note that this is a strategic choice. Localities can decide whether to define data centers as their own class or decenter data center language by passing ordinances that instead capture data centers within a broader industrial category, such as large load customers or high impact facilities. And this can be a helpful tool in states facing preemption concerns or where localities are unable to pass data center specific legislation by, again, defining them much more broadly by resource use. Conditional use permits can establish, like in Chandler, Arizona, that there is no permit unless it's explicitly approved. To me, that sounds like it should be obvious, but that is unfortunately the opposite of how some zoning situations work. And we need to make sure that conditional use permits include binding conditions attached to the approval process, such as, again, water and energy use plans, transparency, environmental impact assessments. And again, to note here that success of this, of this setup requires transparency both in pre-approval and then ongoing monitoring around water, energy, on-site emissions, the value of tax abatements, info on all the companies involved. There's a lot more there in the toolkit. A key part of transparency is robust public notice and community hearing requirements, ending the use of non-disclosure agreements and NDAs, and I'll shout out Tucson, Arizona and Pima County. and critically, the right for localities to reject applications that don't include this transparency and enforcement. We have a lot more details on this section in the toolkit. The link is in the chat, and we are available to answer questions. Next slide. I'm going to be very brief on this one just to highlight that if none of the above options work for you, localities can still take action by limiting where and how data centers are constructed. This can include setback requirements, which is a fancy way of saying the minimum distance between a data center and a residential area, a transit hub, agricultural districts, historic sites. You can also prohibit these types of zoning, agricultural, historic sites, wildlife, from being rezoned to instead be used for data center development. All of these are tools to throw friction into the process and make your locality less attractive for data center developers, particularly hyperscalers. Next slide. To wrap up and set us up for our panel, I want to preview an additional support resource that we will have coming soon that is kind of a how-to document of translating the recommendations that I just summarized to what will work in your locality, since every single jurisdiction is different. So three, overly simplified steps here. The first is to analyze your local conditions and zoning law to understand what is politically feasible in your jurisdiction. Do you have options for legislation? Are ballot measures allowed? Understand the local body that has authority to regulate data center development where you live. This is likely, embedded in zoning and land use authority, but in some cases, there are also what's called police powers in the legislative body that might apply to data center development. And it's important to know, does your local government have to consult a planning board around zoning law changes, or can it make changes unilaterally? Second is critically to check your state law for preemption issues to understand if your locality is allowed to pass exclusionary zoning, other types of zoning changes, local moratoriums, ballot measures, and to see if there are limits on the enforcement mechanisms that you can put in place. For example, some states will designate what a maximum fine could be. And the last point here is to understand existing local and state standards that you can then use to restrict data centers by defining your local goals. Generally, a locality's goals will have to meet or exceed a state's pre-existing goals. One note here is that data centers that already have approval or that have already submitted applications might not be subject to these new changes, but again, that is going to depend on the particulars of your situation. Okay, I am going to pause there. That was a lot of technical information, and open this up to our wonderful panel to talk about what it's like to do this in practice. And I encourage you to drop any technical questions into the Q&A, and Kate, Jenna, and I will try to get to them as the panel unfolds. So let's stop screen sharing, please, and bring up our wonderful panelists. Our discussion is going to focus on how people are organizing on the ground for bans, moratoriums, and zoning restrictions in a wide range of organizing and political environments, and also talk about how these local interventions can help us build state power. I'm going to welcome two incredible organizers and a wonderful movement lawyer to join this conversation. Taylor Frazier McCollum is a community advocate born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Prince George's County in Maryland. She has been leading the fight against a hyperscale data center planned in Landover, Maryland. And her change.org position went viral. They have won and extended a moratorium. We are going to hear how. Liz Simmy is a community organizer based in St. Louis with the Missouri Workers Center, which is building a multiracial worker-led movement to advance the rights and powers of workers on and off the job in rural, urban, and suburban Missouri. And Simmy's work kind of knits together all of this around empowering organizers across the state, fighting specific data center proposals, as well as building statewide power. And Michael Parker is the executive director and managing attorney at Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services, and a nonprofit that provides free and reduced rate legal services and technical assistance in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. If you're there and have questions, message Michael. And critically, Fair Shake also supports communities with legal education and strategic planning. Michael is a Pennsylvania licensed attorney with a background in environmental permitting, zoning, nonprofits, and public health, and will be here to answer the technical questions on the panel. Okay, let's get started. Simmy and Taylor, can you orient us in your fight? How did you come to understand that rampant data center development that you're facing needs to be stopped, not just curtailed or reformed? We're going to start with Liz, and then we'll hear from Taylor.
Hey, yeah, thank you. And thank you for all of this information. I was like taking notes. Yeah, so as an organization, the Missouri Worker Center came into this fight really for like a couple of reasons, which was the first one is that we represent Amazon workers who are currently having their body movements being tracked in the warehouses to train algorithms that are then going to be used to replace them. And all of that data and all of that computational power is coming through these data centers. And so it was really clear early on for us that if we were actually going to protect our workers, we needed to fight these data centers and that those were linked. And then the other thing that was clear to us as a statewide organization is that we do not have the power that we need in the state of Missouri to do anything that represents the people of Missouri. Every win that we have won across in the last like 10 to 15 years, it within kind of the urban cores have been clawed back by the state legislator, which is completely bought out by corporate interests. And so, as organizers, we were really crystal clear that it was not going to be, while there was like this organic opposition, it was just going to get crushed by the way in which our state legislator is just completely bought out. And so we needed to really unite and work together and build the kind of coalition that could win. And so that's really what we've been doing is actually getting, aligning our site fights across the state on weekly calls and kind of like what we're doing within this like national coalition, sharing strategy, but also starting to build power towards a statewide moratorium, and really thinking through like all the intricacies of that. And like Jenna was saying, going beyond this NIMBYism because we don't want these anywhere in Missouri. And that's like the first thing that people do is they go, well, put them in the cities, we'll put them in the rural areas, we'll put them wherever. And we're saying no, like not for anybody. There's something fundamentally wrong with this because again, we're crystal clear on workers being at the heart of everything we do and wanting to actually make sure that our all of our interests are protected. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Not in anyone's backyard. I think that's the call to action here. Taylor, I'm going to turn it over to you to walk us through the Landover fight, and how you got to the current point in your organizing. And Kate is going to share those slides for us.
Thank you. All right, so I like to consider Landover an uphill battle. And I'm going to explain to you guys how the data center fight in Prince George's County is going and how we got here. So next slide. So this next slide after this one is going to explain what laws were passed to get us here and why legislation matters in our fight. Next slide. Okay, so before we even started to fight off the hyperscale data centers in 2020, we had Governor Larry Hogan enact Senate Bill 397. And this bill basically just waived the 6% sales and use tax for data centers that would come into the state. So that opened the floodgates kind of for them to transition from Virginia into Maryland. And then in 2021, the Prince George's County Council passed CB 001-2021, which fast-tracked permitting approval of qualified data centers. And even on our county's like economic development corporation website, they had a whole like packet on how you can bring a data center to Prince George's County and get cheap energy and other things like that. So it was really like advertising for data center investors to come to Prince George's. Next slide. And then in 2024, the Prince George's County Planning Board approved Brightsea Tech Park, which would have been a 4-building, 820 megawatt campus with a $5 billion investment to build the hyperscale data center campus. But of course, that investment was not going to go to the community. It was going to go to rebuilding the infrastructure, the lines and transmission things that are needed to run that type of data center in our area. Next slide. So, initially when I found out about the Bright Tech Park campus, it was from an email my friend shared with me, that was from Business Insider. And I was shocked to learn about the data center being built in Landover because it was like, wait a minute, I didn't see any hearings or, they didn't do any meetings about this. But when they passed that law in 2021 to fast track the data centers, that kind of eliminated the need for meetings with the county and such. So, I ended up watching a video from a More Perfect Union about the pollution that Meta was doing in Georgia and how it was affecting their community. So I started brainstorming ideas in about April, May of last year. And then I reached out to our local politician who was newly elected as a council member for that district where the site of the data center would be, and she didn't really have a input in it, and she kind of just was like, if I have a statement on it, I'll let you know when I release a statement. So I was like, no problem, what else can I do? So June 21st I started the No Landover Data Center petition, and from June to August I was doing that just by myself, promoting it online on Facebook. And then the Party for Socialism and Liberation reached out to create a reel on Instagram, which ended up, next slide, it ended up going viral. So, to push the movement forward, we dropped the reel on social media the first week of September. And the Party for Socialism and Liberation already had like a decent sized following. So when I'm telling people how they can best prevent data centers in their area, social media is a very big part of this whole strategy that we used. And they had, I think, around like 90,000 followers on there. So that allowed the reel to be seen by more people. And then those people shared it and shared it and shared it. And now today the reel has over 300,000 views. And the petition has, I needed to update this slide, over 23,000 signatures at this moment. And then the county council and the county executive both enacted a moratorium on data center approval in Prince George's County after the petition went viral. Next slide. Okay, so this is basically just saying like where we are now and where we want to go in the future. Next slide. So, the Qualified Data Center Task Force was created to kind of go over like what data centers were for our county and what that would mean for our county. We were able to have almost 500 people at that meeting on 10/25 last year. And the moratorium was extended from December 31st until April 30th of this year. Next slide. So on April 30th of this year, we'll find out if our moratorium is over or if it will be extended. We're going to continue to pressure the county council and the county executive. We're also starting to research legal ways that we can officially stop the land oversight. As of right now, the land oversight, of course, could be still grandfathered in because the moratorium was done after it was approved. But what we do know is that they have not applied for additional permits. So we feel like we are in the clear that they're not going to try to build this hyperscale data center in Landover. But we want to ask for a permanent ban because they're now saying other parts of our county are at risk. So we are using our political education skills to educate the public on what candidates would be best suited to ban data centers. And we're going to be having a candidate forum on May 2nd, which is this Saturday from 10 to 12. And that's for our county council at large forum. So just a real quick before I end, this is my last slide. Our government is structured with a county council made up of 11 members. 9 of them are for districts, and then 2 of them are at large. And then over them, you have a county executive. So we want to try to get the best people in position for all of those to help ban data centers in Prince George's County permanently. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. Someone in the chat called that a masterclass, and I have to agree. We're going to hear more about the strategies you've used in just a moment. Michael, I'm hoping you can help us zoom back briefly because we have some technical questions I also want you to get to. What are you seeing across the states where Fair Shake works in terms of the impact of the build out and the response?
Sure. I mean, I think regardless of what state you're in, the impacts of data centers are fairly consistent. I mean, there's always going to be some nuanced local issue, whether it's an endangered species that might be impacted, a particularly sensitive economic issue or environmental justice issue related to siting. But broadly, the issues are pretty much the same, no matter who's calling us from what community. You're looking at just the spike in energy demand that we are all very familiar with. You could see pretty large rate increases depending on the scale of the data center involved. Eventually, I mean, it might take some time for that to shake through the procedural processes. Um, Water consumption is also a large issue. Both the energy and water consumption concerns drive an infrastructure build out that is often the costs of which are often passed on to the ratepayers in general, not to the specific developer of the data center. So one good strategy here is always to try to transfer that cost back over to the developer and make them pay for the infrastructure build out. Um, Other issues with water is overconsumption, and not just for the people concerned. It could have large impacts on nearby wetlands or other sensitive ecosystems because there needs to be a certain recharge of the aquifers that might not be happening depending on how the data center is drawing the water. Uh, Localized pollution problems, particularly air quality, is something that happens over and over again. I'm particularly familiar with a data center proposal in Springdale, Pennsylvania, where they're proposing, I believe, 140 separate diesel generators on the site. And in comparison, the entire University of Pittsburgh, a major university in the city of Pittsburgh, only has 86 diesel generators for the entire footprint of the campus. So it's a large amount of air pollution that could be triggered at any time where there's a power outage. The air rules often require them to be tested on an annual basis, so you might be getting testing that happens even if if there's no power outage issues, and that can cause pretty intense air quality issues. Diesel is a known diesel emissions are a known carcinogen. It can also lead to problems with smog. Nitrogen oxide is a major pollutant from any combustion source. That could lead to localized smog issues. It could lead to localized nitrogen oxide issues, and then just the regular particulate matter, which is a significant pollutant of concern in most urban areas.
Thank you.
Uh,
Did you have one more point there?
I was going to say noise is another really important thing to consider, and as well as other nuisance issues that might be associated with a data center, like truck traffic or heat discharges or the like, and those can all be dealt with on the local level. And then there's just division within the community, NDAs, transparency issues that cause a lot of concerns.
I appreciate you laying those out, and I want to highlight that all of those can be entry points for organizing, as well as in most cases, zoning as well. So we tried to lay out kind of a menu of options and entry points, and I appreciate you three kind of painting the picture and three very different environments. We're going to talk about bans and moratoriums in a bit more focused way now. Taylor, can you walk us through your push for a moratorium? We heard some of your organizing strategies before, but what did you use that was most effective in getting that moratorium across the line?
Sure. I'll say that the rally we held on September 10th and the amount of signatures we got on the petition were kind of like the driving force, because when we held the rally, we were kind of like one line, one band, one sound. We all said the same thing when we got up there, that we didn't agree with the data center being placed there. We wanted to see some legislation or something put in place. There were people that were already working on it in the community that I had not met previously. But then once I was introduced to them, it was kind of like we were able to get the ban a little faster than other places possibly, because we already had those organizations like Sierra Club, Sustainable Hyattsville, Friends of the Lower Beaver Dam Creek and stuff. They had actually challenged the law previously, so it wasn't as lax as it could have been. So something, I forget the bill number, but it did not pass because of those activists. So once I came into the picture and then we combined our forces, it was like the council had no choice but to kind of take what we were giving them and put it into place. So once we gave the council like our demands, kind of they took some time to mull it over. By the October 25th meeting, before the October 25th meeting, they had already put the moratorium in place. So it was kind of a little easier for us to get our moratorium because there were already people working on being anti-data center before I came into the picture. So yeah, so that's why our fight, I feel like, is a little different than other places. And then we are just trying to figure out state legislation, how we can kind of unite and bring that about. Because our governor, Westmore, has said that if data centers want to come online, they've only got to do three things, and that includes bring your own generation.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the way you talk about it of this is the phase now and then what's next, right? And how do we keep protecting people? Um, Michael, can you walk us through what local organizers and policymakers need to know to figure out if they have the authority in their jurisdiction to pass a ban or a pause on data center development? How do they know if they can do what Taylor and others did in PG County?
Sure, sure. This is really a preemption question from a legal perspective. And what preemption is it's basically a priority of law. So the higher level of government their laws take priority over the same issue than lower level of governments. So, but so if a state government or the federal government passes a law addressing data center siting, that would preempt a local government from doing anything about it. Um, Now, there are a variety of ways that preemption can occur. There can be an explicit preemption, and if you're explicitly preempted, you probably already know in your community that it's probably big news. It's probably impacting how you already do your advocacy. It's the other types of preemption, the implicit preemptions, that are a little bit more tough to figure out. So there's two types of implicit preemption, and I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty about any of that. But there are two types, and I'll let you know what those are. There's a field preemption, and what that says is that the higher level government has so thoroughly regulated the field that the lower level government, there's really nothing left for them to do. You see that at the federal level with immigration, or in some instances, environmental issues like nuclear power is field preempted. So. That's often pretty obvious, but it often takes a court decision to kind of spell it out. Then there's conflict preemption, where the higher level of government has a law that is in conflict with the local level, and whenever there's a conflict between the two, meaning you can't comply with both of them at the same time, the higher level of government's always going to control. Um, so that's preemption basically. How do you know if that's happening in your community? Basic search would give you some indication, but on making sure you have the specifics, I would really counsel you to get local a state barred attorney in your local jurisdiction to help you out with that. Um, some of you might not have the resources to do that. There are plenty of legal clinics at local law schools. So if you are under-resourced, there are legal clinics at many law schools. If you are, there's plenty of pro bono clinics and organizations like mine throughout the country. So just look for pro bono representation, and hopefully you can find some. Uh, uh, Reach out to me if you're really looking and having trouble, and I'll be happy to help you find representation in your community. Um, so I guess the bottom line is you will eventually have to get an attorney to really answer this question fully.
Thank you for walking through that. Incredibly helpful, Michael.
Yeah.
Liz, going to the environment you're organizing in, where you are dealing with preemption, can you talk through how you are building power towards a statewide moratorium or other demands, both in terms of this organizing ecosystem supporting localities in this red state, as well as these technical concerns?
Yeah, totally. And I think so I would say like a few things. Like one of the things we do from jump in my trainings is like distinguish organizing from other forms of social change. So like, and I'm not taking a crack at you, Michael, but like we do want to distinguish between advocacy, which is like what lawyers do,
Mm.
and even I think what a lot of our organizations are used to doing, which is like a few experts going in and advocating for everyone else. The problem with that is you end up, if Michael's not there, what do we do, right? If we don't have a lawyer yet, what do we do? Right. And so it's advocacy should be one part of a social change, like theory of change, and organizing, which is actually building and developing leaders, needs to be a part of your strategy if you're going to actually make this kind of long-term shift. And so, like, what I mean by that is, like, I give the example of like Investis, which made national news because they ousted their city council folks who who supported the data center all the way through. Were completely, I mean, you should read the Sunshine Law, like the Sunshine documents of their council talking, I can't curse on here, but talking bad mouthing about the people of Festus. And those people went door to door and knocked doors in their neighborhood for months and weeks. And that is actually how they got to that result, was because everybody in Festus got a knock on their door about this issue and was engaged in a conversation. And that is like the real person to person work that we're trying to actually do with this if we're going to actually make the kind of shift that we're wanting to see. And so, yeah, we're trying to get everybody kind of obsessed with that idea across the state, because you can have all the advocacy in the world and you can be so correct and have like the best ideas, and it doesn't matter if you don't have power. It just doesn't matter, because it's easy to just dismiss you and just have your arguments twisted into something else. So it's really getting folks focused on that person to person work. Yeah, and then I would just say, like, there's so many like nuances. I was like trying to take notes of like, oh, I could talk about this or this or this, because we have fights across the state. But one thing that I'll just name in this that's been successful in a lot of areas is um, our people, by kind of having these like wider conversations, they're getting in touch with, former planning and zoning people, or people who are secretly on our side who can't, take, whatever, right? So even like once you do that big power building and like getting wide and getting big, you don't know who's going to come into your camp who has the knowledge that you need in order to win this, right? And so these are places where it's like, it's a lot of like kind of waiting and building, and it's harder work. It's much harder than just doing something yourself, because that's a lot of us are tempted to do, as a lot of brilliant people on this call. But actually training up and building that capacity in your community is actually going to be the thing that moves this needle in a different direction, and as I say, like, launch us out of this toilet that we're in.
Thank you so much, Liz. I think that's really critical to understanding, and Taylor, your organizing work shows this so well. Is what is going to push a technical intervention across the line, if we have one, is this people power. So I really, really appreciate that
And
grounding.
if I could just interject very quickly, I know we're limited on time, but this is making me think of a situation that happened in Cancer Alley where the community, was hosting lawyers going around checking things out. And it was only through that like really on the ground communications that they were able to discover some non-environmental hooks to try to stop some facilities. So sometimes you might find really nuanced, specific local issues. In this particular instance, it was the graves of enslaved people from back in the 1800s that was being impacted by a development, and that was a pretty big hook to try to stop that development. So it really pays to interface for a legal practitioner with the local community in many ways.
Thank you so much. We're going to do a lightning round for our last set of prepped questions so that we can get to a few in the Q&A. And Taylor, I'm going to start with you. Lightning fast. What zoning changes would, or other policy change, would actually protect residents of Prince George's County, and how are you organizing for this?
Oh, sure. So if they went back to the detailed site plans and allow for these businesses to have to go through more hearings and more speculations, then that would be better for us. And then I also think if on a state level they would focus on a moratorium or something as well, that would be good for us too.
Thank you. So just things I want to uplift in that, right? Like actual public notice, actual community involvement, and embedding that in the requirement for how any development comes to town. Also just lifting up a quick question in the chat. Are out of state or county signatures helpful for the Landover petition? That's something people wanted to know.
Yes, they are. They are. Thank you so much.
Great. We'll drop that in. Michael, I want to go to you next in talking about zoning, and I'm going to throw in a question from the chat as well. What are your tips for understanding and using zoning and land use regulations to counter this build out, especially where there is preemption from a ban? And if you can also speak to concerns that people have shared in the chat around facing lawsuits from developers for discriminatory zoning, that would be helpful.
I'll start with that one first so that I don't forget it. What that's referring to is often referred to in the legal world as a SLAP suit, strategic lawsuit against public participation. It happens very regularly in a lot of different circumstances. We see it a lot with oil and gas development. Um, there's really no way to stop, to stop someone from filing a frivolous lawsuit against you. It's pretty much impossible. What you can do is protect yourself from liability in these circumstances by really you have to stick with the truth. Don't fluff up your statements to try to convince more people. If you're talking about the data center's impacts, if you're talking about how it's going to impact the local community, don't exaggerate. It's bad enough as it is. You want to stick with the truth. The truth is often a defense against many of these suits are defamation lawsuits. So the truth is always a defense in a defamation lawsuit. And there's obviously a lot more to it, but that's generally what we counsel our clients when they're facing slap suit risks is just to be really careful with your public statements, stick to the truth.
Thank you so much.
Now, the other question, if you could remind me briefly what it was now that I've spoke.
Yes, no, and I appreciate you jumping in for that first question. What are your tips where people are preempted for understanding and using zoning or land use regulations to counter the build out in ways that actually help their locality stop a data center from coming in?
Well, you have to look at just how preempted you might be. Various jurisdictions have levels of preemption. For instance, in West Virginia, data center local control over data center siting is preempted for in certain kind of narrow circumstances, microgrid, high impact facilities. In Pennsylvania, it's not preempted, but there are speed permitting processes that kind of act like almost a preemption. And then in Ohio, it's not currently preempted, but there's always discussion. I heard about a proposal yesterday. So make sure you understand just how preempted you are. If you're not fully preempted, there might be still things that you can do, some siting restrictions, that size restrictions that can still be done in some light preemption scenarios. There are also other local police power mechanisms that can be used to really impact data center development outside of the normal zoning process. I'm thinking things like noise ordinances, truck traffic or vehicle traffic controls, heat discharge controls, light pollution controls. All of these things, if properly regulated with a strong ordinance, can really impact whether a company chooses to site in a particular location. Um, so, there's a whole host of other things, and I want to be conscious of the time here. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. But new land development ordinances are another one. Stormwater issues can often be regulated pretty vigorously by the municipality. And then there could also be host agreements based on conditions that could protect some of the community concerns.
Thank you so much. Liz, I'm going to ask you a final question incorporating some thoughts from the chat, and then Taylor, I'll give you another 30 seconds if you want to say anything to close us out. Liz, can you talk us through how you're connecting this more in the weed zoning and land use fights in Missouri with broader organizing against the power of the AI industry over workers and everyday people, and pulling in some questions from the chat, either particularly in the face of local officials being really pro data centers because they need jobs and need money in the town. That floor is yours.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you've got to get crystal clear on who the enemies are, who's actually driving this. And so that's like, I think there's like a specific question around New Brunswick. Like the thing I would say is like there's real power mapping that we should be doing to figure out who is actually pulling the strings and who locally is rolling out the red carpet for this, because it's almost always connected to, a whole host of other local issues. So like we've got folks in from my coalition on the call in rural communities. Depending on where you are, there's almost always lots of folks who have benefited from these types of agreements that were not data centers in these local areas for generations, right? And so making that connection to who are the local villains who are supporting this data center build out is really important. And then actually, those are people that you can actually directly confront. So we can't necessarily, in our little fights, we're trying to build that power and build out that network. We're not totally there yet to take on big tech. Like that's the reality. We're not. And so there was like the other question of like, well, we could like make these demands and whatever. It's like we need to just be crystal clear. We have Donald Trump as our president. Like we have like some real barriers to thinking about who and who's actually in power right now. Like we need to just be honest about that. And then we need to actually be with that crystal clear on building the power that we need, which involves going after local targets who are enabling this. And so then like, I have specific talking points, which I'll try to like draft up an email to whoever asked that question around all those, intricacies, but just like high level, that's where I would go.
Thank you. Closing words, Taylor.
Yes, I just want to say if anyone is out there fighting a hyperscaler, that you have power, you can build like the saying that people power, and you can stop them. You don't have to accept it as inevitable. So thank you guys so much for coming to this webinar. I really appreciate you for having me on.
Thank you so much. We're just going to do a few things to wrap us up while Jenna keeps answering questions in the Q&A. Kate, can you launch the poll, the follow-up poll? We would love for people to do this, answer 2 questions before you leave us today. I want to thank our incredible panel. You all bring so much wisdom and on-the-ground expertise. The next session of our training series is next Wednesday, same time, focused on water, air, and public health. We're going to learn from Amy Adams at the Southeast Climate and Energy Network, Keyshawn Pearson at Memphis Community Against Pollution, and Andrea Pierce and Amber Fellows in Ypsilanti, Michigan, who just successfully passed a very exciting water ban around data centers. That's bringing together Amber, a city councilor, and Andrea at the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition. A few ways to get involved. Next slide, please. Next slide again. We will share all these resources out in the chat and after the fact. Here are the links to the toolkit and upcoming trainings. If you are engaged in a site fight and you're on the ground, we also have a site fight guide from the Data Center Working Group laying out a lot of the tips that Taylor and Liz shared. Thank you, Liz, for your contributions to the toolkit or to the site fight guide. Next slide. And also sharing out ways to get involved in the data center fights that you heard about today. We have the interest form for the nationwide working group. We also have monthly site fight solidarity and support calls. And then here are links for the No Landover Data Center fight if you're in the region, No Mo Dirty Data Centers in Missouri, and resources to get that legal support from Fair Shake Environmental Legal Services. We are so grateful to everyone here. I just want to say that our numbers of how much we understand how to use bans, moratoriums, and zoning have significantly increased. We were at 50%, and I think now we're at, if I can do math, close to 85 to 90. So thank you to everybody, wishing you well in your fights, and we will see you next week. Thank you.